fruit from which you are ordained to produce. It is the divine law of God bringing forth the issue of God. If you will abide, if you will allow, if you will remain in that union. Now that's part one. Part two. Genesis 1:26. It says that God said, let us make man in our own image, in our likeness. Genesis 2:6. Go to 2:7. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden. There he put the man whom he had formed, and out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight, good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted, and became into four heads. What you just read in Genesis is the equivalent of what we just read in John. They are exactly the same thing. One Old Testament union, the other the New Testament union, but they are both the unions of God that He sets forth for the purpose of bringing forth that fruit. The life of God on earth. Now, in the midst of both of these is the exact same situation. God says in the midst of this union of God and man in Genesis, there are two trees which represent two choices. Now, the question posed in New Testament and in Old Testament is exactly the same. The question posed is, will you keep the union? Will you stay where I have placed you? Or will you violate that union by coming out of that place? There was not then, nor is there now, anything more sinister in what Adam did than to make a decision to do his will instead of God's. What we have to understand, and what I will show you this morning, is that God looks at this. It does not make any difference if we say to God, you know what, I know I should, but if I can say to God, I know that I should do this, but I'm going to do something else, that is not insignificant to God. To choose your will, no matter what it is, no matter how significant or insignificant that you might feel that it is, to choose your will over God violates the union. God looks at that in the sense of spiritual fornication. We were talking last Sunday. Those of you that know what we were talking about last Sunday. Someone, and I'm not clearly remembering, someone said, well, don't you understand that if God lays something on your heart that it's for God's purpose for you to do it? And someone responded by a shrug of their shoulders. What we have to understand is that is spiritual fornication. Now you might think, or they might think, or someone might think, well, that's insignificant. Let me ask you a question in the natural. If you are married, or if you are a spouse to be married, and your partner commits fornication, is it insignificant? If your husband or your wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, was to come to you and say, hey, listen, you know, the other night I was out and I know I shouldn't, but I committed fornication, would we say, well, that's insignificant? Nor does God when we choose our will over His, no matter how insignificant we choose to think that it is. Because what it does is it breaks that union and goes back into that old nature. John 15, if you're there, in fact, John 15 if you're not. It says in the 9th verse, as the Father hath loved me, so have I loved you. Continue in my love. If you keep my commandments, you shall abide in my love. What does that tell me? If you keep my commandments, you shall abide in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things have I spoken unto you, that your joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full. This is my commandment, that you love one another. This is what he said to John. To John he said, keep my commandments, abide in my love as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. Here's what he said. Here's what he said in the same situation to Adam in the garden. In Genesis 2:16. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. But for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. Prior to the fall, man was in the image of God. Prior to the fall, man was in the garden of God. Prior to the fall, man communed with God, spoke with God, heard God's voice. God gave him commandments. God who is Spirit. So then man, prior to the fall, was led by the Spirit. That's the New Testament. So prior to the fall, it was the exact same thing as the New Testament. God says to him, here's the deal. I'm going to give you a commandment, and by that commandment, I'm giving you a choice. And the choice comes down to this: whether or not you will abide in me, or you violate that union by choosing your own will. Violate or abide. Abide or violate. Disobedience is violation of the union and abortion of the life. Disobedience. I'm not trying here. I'm not trying here to be abrupt. I'm not trying to in any way do anything except to give you the truth. Disobedience in any form, to any degree, is a contraceptive to the life of God. He said, if you will abide in that union, you will bear fruit. If you do not abide, and I'm talking about in both cases, in Genesis 2 or John 15, if you abide in that union, you stay in that garden, you'll bear fruit. But if you fail to do so in both of them, he said, you will be cast out, and you will wither, and you will die. Now we know they made the wrong choice. Now, when we understand that it was the same principle that governed him that governs us, then we can understand that the same principles are applied right now. In Genesis, the 3rd chapter and the 6th verse, and when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto the man with her, and he did eat. They disobeyed God, and this I will show you today is indeed spiritual fornication. There is only one grounds that Christ or God gives for divorce. Is that right? What is that ground?
Fornication.
Fornication. That is the only grounds for divorce. In the 3rd chapter, the 24th verse of Genesis, so he drove out the man. If you look up that word, you'll find out that it means that one of the meanings of the word is divorce. It's the word garash. And it means to cast out or to divorce. It is correctly applied, because Adam has become and done that which